Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to another Not So Mini wrap-up. I haven't updated you in about over a month on the things that I've been reading. I've just been uploading other videos. So let me start with the books that I have recently read, and I'm going to go through these as quickly as possible because there's a lot to talk about. In some recent videos, you heard that I finished Agnes Grey and a reread of Jane Eyre. I'm not going to talk about them too much here. Jane Eyre, I reread. This is probably the 5th time I've reread it, and I gave it 5 stars. Agnes Grey was the last of the Bronte novels new to me to read, and it was a disappointment, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I borrowed a number of audiobooks from the library recently, one of which was Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. This comes highly recommended not only from Winks and Ink here on BookTube, but also from the My Favorite Murder podcast, and I decided to give it a listen. I enjoyed this, and I felt like a lot of the messages in here are really powerful and that everybody should read this book, but I wasn't super blown away. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, enjoyed it, and would be interested in reading more of Brown's work. I also finally got to Not My Father's Son by Alan Cumming. This is a memoir of his and his relationship with his father. I really liked the structure of this, and I enjoyed hearing the audiobook narrated from his own voice, but again, it didn't super resonate with me, and I think part of that was because it was so hyped on BookTube when it was first released that I had unrealistic expectations, but I did enjoy it and gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I also wanted to participate in Stephen King Reading Month that Becky M hosts every August, but the only audiobook of Stephen King's that I was interested in that was available was Mr. Mercedes, which is fine. I wanted to get to it, but I was kind of hoping to listen to The Shining or Misery, but it's okay. Mr. Mercedes, I gave 3 out of 5 stars as well. I enjoyed it, and I think that the book did exactly what it set out to do. It was well plotted. I really enjoyed the character of Bill Hodges. However, it did go to too dark places for me too often by having the narrative split between not only Bill's perspective, but also the murderer's perspective. And so we were in the murderer's mind for about a third of the book, and for me, that was just not a pleasant experience. So hence 3 out of 5 stars. I also finally finished reading The Tale of Holly Howe by Susan Albert Wittig. This is the second book in the Cottage Tales of Beatrix Potter series. This is a mystery series featuring Beatrix Potter as one of the main characters, as well as the furry friends around the village. There's always one or multiple mysteries happening in the books, and it's all very cozy and nice. This one I found was a little bit slow moving. The mystery, even though it was a death, a potential murder, didn't feel intense at all and at any time. It didn't feel like anybody was particularly worried about it at any time, which is weird. I also found a lot of the text was taken up with being in different characters' minds and hearing their thoughts, and they were just so wholesome as to be almost sickly sweet at times. Overall, I didn't feel compelled to continue reading when I picked it up. However, it was still enjoyable, and I am interested to see if the third book is perhaps as compelling as the first was. The second book also does have badgers as characters in it, which was really interesting for me considering I just finished a nonfiction about badgers. But before I move on to tell you about that, I gave The Tale of Holly Howe 3 out of 5 stars. The badger book I finally finished was Patrick Barkham's Badgerlands, The Twilight World of Britain's Most Enigmatic Animal. I almost nailed it. I have been working on this for many months and finally finished it. And even though I paused in the middle of reading this for a couple months and didn't touch it, coming back to it was as enjoyable as when I was originally reading it. Not many books for me can sit there stale on the shelf, so to speak, and me still enjoy them a lot when I finish reading it. What I really enjoyed about this is that each chapter is structured with kind of like a theme. So for instance, one chapter is about the literary references to badgers, specifically to Mr. Badger of The Wind in the Willows and how our perception of badgers is from there. Another chapter is on the legal laws that have been passed in reflection on badger hunting or badger conservation. Another is about the tradition of badger baiting and why people do that and what the circumstances of that are. I really enjoyed the structure of this. It also was incredibly readable, even though it did go into some laws. This is just what I want out of a nonfiction. The only reason why I didn't give it 5 out of 5 stars is that not every chapter had the pacing or enjoyment. I also found there is this story thread through this of Patrick Barkham trying to find and witness a badger in the wild. He's only ever seen them in captivity. And I felt that storyline, which probably was really important and impactful to him, I wasn't super concerned because it's not like I was there finally seeing a badger in the wild. But if that was missing, then I feel like this would have been a drier nonfiction. So even though it has a purpose, I didn't particularly enjoy it, I guess. But I still gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed it. I'm super glad that M.A. Anders recommended this to me and that I finally got to it. I also listened to the 4th Cresseted Cowl. This one is How to Cheat a Dragon's Curse. It's narrated by David Tennant, as always, who makes it magical. This story, as much as I enjoyed listening to it and listened to it very quickly, I felt like it was a side adventure. It didn't further any of our characters in their relationships, really, or in their character development. It definitely felt like a side adventure somehow. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars instead of 5 out of 5 because I did enjoy the first 3 a lot more and I felt like they were going somewhere. This doesn't mean that this didn't have enjoyable parts. I really enjoyed hearing about the potato. It just didn't have the sparkle of the first 3. So there you go. I still highly recommend it though. Let's talk about a couple duds. I got to the audiobook of Tess of the Durbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is a reread for me. I read this about 10 years ago, maybe less, when I was in college. I remember the first time I read this thinking it was like a 3-star book, that I liked it. There were a lot of things I remember underlining in the copy I had then of beautiful writing, but I remember being very disappointed with the ending, which I'm not going to go into. Upon this reread, I feel like I connected with the text more. I was able to analyze it a little bit more, but I still didn't love it. I really enjoyed Tess as a character in this one. I don't remember having any opinion of her when I first read it. The second time reading it, I really saw how strong she was for being so, even though she was so young and naive. I really appreciated how Thomas Hardy made it very clear that what happened to her was not her fault, even though society condemns her that it was her fault, and he in fact isn't condemning society in their opinion. However, for me that sentiment's too little too late, especially since we have 2 male characters, Angel and Alec, who just infuriated me and I wanted them to never be on the page. I also found Tess was, I don't know if it was quite objectified, but Thomas Hardy was very concerned with describing how lovely she was all of the time, and it did feel kind of voyeuristic, or at least that Thomas Hardy was in love with his own creation, which was a little weird. I also wasn't particularly pleased with the idea that because she was pure and wonderful on the outside, that was an indication of pure and wonderfulness on the inside. I know that's a trope, especially for Victorian works, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. So Tess of the Durbervilles, I will probably keep this on my shelves at least for a while, but this was a 2 out of 5 star read for me. It just isn't enjoyable. Another realization I had about Thomas Hardy is that I don't know if he's an author for me. To be brief, I sometimes get this feeling, this like aura or this like scent or sense with authors writing. For instance, Ray Bradbury always reminds me of like a cozy blanket and candles. Shirley Jackson's writing reminds me of looking at pictures of 1950s vintage like dresses, and even though there might be something uncomfortable or weird about them, they're just so beautiful and nostalgic. And Thomas Hardy, his writing, the best way I can describe it to you would be you're outside at like a picnic on a bright summer day with other people, and though this sounds like a lovely thing, for me, I hate so many things about that sort of situation. Being out in public, being in the heat, having to talk with other people, warm food that isn't supposed to be warm. There's so much about that just kind of With Thomas Hardy, I just kind of always feel this underlying vein of dread and just like, just with his writing. So I'm not sure that I will ever be able to love any books by this author who just gives me kind of that vibe. And I think that's all on me, but that's my experience. Moving on. With the aid of an audiobook, I finally finished James S.A. Corey's Leviathan Wakes. This is the first book in the Expanse series, which comes highly, highly recommended from Becky M., which is why I picked up the first one, but this just didn't jive with me. My favorite part was when our 2 point of view characters came together and were physically in the same space, but that was such a brief encounter relative to the rest of this chunky beast that the rest of it just didn't really capture my attention all that much. I found the world to be more complicated and kind of confusing than I was hoping. The action and like threat sequences were so often. I think maybe this was too intense for me. So I'm bummed because I was hoping that this would be a series that I would love and gobble up, but none of the characters super connected with me or compelled me, and I found the ending to be kind of frustrating. There was also this aspect to one character, Miller, where the women in his life he saw kind of as apparitions who would judge his actions or communicate with him, and I felt like that was kind of objectifying them, that these women weren't like actual humans. The important thing was Miller's perception of them, and that was their reality, and I didn't think that was very fair for the women in his life. So I gave this 2 out of 5 stars and won't be continuing with this series, and I'm super bummed. I finished Sandy Jeff's The Mad Poet's Tea Party and gave this 3 out of 5 stars. This is a poetry collection focusing on mental illness and medication with some Alice in Wonderland twists to it. There were not as much Alice in Wonderland literary references as I wanted, and especially as this book kind of sells itself to be. And the poems themselves weren't really my jam. They were rawer than I like. I prefer more lyrical poetry where I'm marveling at how the words are put together rather than feeling the emotion of the poet. Overall, I think this collection did what it set out to do, and I admire what it was setting out to do, but it just didn't work for me. It wasn't my favorite kind of poetry, unfortunately, but still 3 out of 5 stars. If this sounds up your alley, you should definitely check it out. I finally finished this short story collection by Ray Bradbury, One More for the Road. This was a 3 out of 5 star reading experience. There were some stories in here that stood out to me and I could still tell you what they were about. Like there was one called like The 19th or The 19, and it's about a elderly man picking up golf balls in the middle of the night, but it ends up being kind of more about dementia. There's another one about a movie whose film reels are put out of order, and that makes the movie great where it would have been mediocre in the correct order. But none of these stories captured my imagination or thrilled me like some of his other short story collections. So this was a 3 out of 5 star rather than a 4, but I still really enjoyed feeling cozy all the way through, even these dark and weird stories by Mr. Bradbury. By far, the recent highlight is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. I buddy read this with Sarai from Sarai Talks Books. This is the second book in the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, following The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This is a loose sequel to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I feel like you'll get the most out of it if you have read the first book before jumping into this one, but this one very much goes off on its own. This was wonderful. I love Becky Chambers' writing style. It reminds me of Ray Bradbury. Every time I go to one of her books, I know that I'm not going to have to hold my breath. I'm not going to think who's going to die next, who's going to be sexually assaulted next. I don't have to worry about it. There has no dread involved in the reading experience. I love how the world building that she creates is full of hope and connection and humans and other species and beings just being good to one another. Not that bad things don't ever happen in her world, but we don't have to witness them or dwell on them. This follows 2 narratives, one from an AI who has newly been put in a human-like body, and then also a character who was a manufactured human who has since gained her freedom through a lot of hard work. Pepper, the created human, her story was very interesting. I loved how we jumped between present day when she's in her 30s back to even as young as when she was 9 or 10, and then we kind of grow up with her. I feel like Chambers perfectly captured the voices of the different ages, and I loved how all of the details that we hear that Pepper has, her likes and dislikes and her habits, we can see how they developed through her childhood. I also am a sucker for books with AI in them. I was concerned when this first came out, since I had just finished reading and loving the Imperial Watch trilogy by Anne Leckie, which is also about an AI, that this would pale in comparison. I'm glad that I gave the Imperial Watch trilogy room to breathe before picking this up, because this might have paled in comparison at the time, but now, since I've had some years between reading that trilogy and this, I was able to appreciate this for what it is and not compare it to other AI stories I love. I really enjoyed hearing more about the Aluan species, who is a species of alien who communicate through color on their faces and have to get voice implants to communicate through sound. Their culture was super fascinating, especially hearing about their family structures. I loved it. So I will stop gushing there. I absolutely love Becky Chambers' writing. I look forward to reading the third book in this series at the end of the year, and also getting my hands on that novella if it ever comes in at my library. So I read quite a few things off of my physical TBR lately. I am super proud of myself and getting that TBR back down. I have picked up a couple things, which has bumped my TBR back up to 32. Let me tell you about them. My pre-order of Caitlin Doty's new nonfiction, Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? Big Questions from Tiny Mortals About Death finally came in. This is a book where she takes the questions that she's heard from children regarding death, decomposition, and whatnot, and answers them. It also is seemingly beautifully illustrated by, I will give you the artist's name in a second, by Diane Ruse, I think is how you would say it. I'm really excited to jump into this for Nonfiction November, and I'm also really excited to get another book from Caitlin Doty. I hope I enjoy this a bit more than I did her second. I have also purchased but not yet received Christmas at Thompson Hall and Other Christmas Stories by Anthony Trollope. This is a short story collection by Anthony Trollope, collecting his Christmassy short stories all together. I tried to see if I could piecemeal get these on the Kindle, but I couldn't, and it's pretty, and I wanted to have a physical copy of Christmas at Thompson Hall since it's my favorite thing by Trollope so far. So hopefully that will come in soon and it will be lovely, and I will read it in December. So September for me is going to be trying to get some books finished up before Victober happens. Let me show you what I am currently working on. I'm still plugging through the sonnets by William Shakespeare. They're going fine. They're love sonnets. I don't particularly like love poems, but that's okay. I still am appreciating them, and there are a few that I have quite liked. Some of them I'm just like fine with, but I'm still going to work my way through the sonnets in the hope of something. In the hope of paying homage to Libby Stevenson. I have less than 100 pages left of No Great Mischief by Alistair MacLeod, which I keep telling you is like based off of his family, but it's not. It's a straight novel. It's made up. It's the family of Alexander MacDonald, and apparently I saw the A and I saw the Mac and I didn't read any farther, so I'm a bit embarrassed about that. I'm enjoying this. It's pretty fast-paced, though it is not a linear story because we have like one linear timeline and then we'll like ruminate into the past, but I really am enjoying it so far. Alistair MacLeod's stories and this novel, from what I've read, are really deeply rooted in Scottish immigrants to Canada from like before Canada was an actual independent country, with that folklore, and really interested in paying homage to ancestors. He often deals with grief and hardship, but in a way that is still kind of refreshing and beautiful. And there is something like autumnal and like homespun kind of, like, it seems very Canadian, if just call the Canadians homespun. Anyway, I will stop talking and stop making an idiot of myself. I'm enjoying this, looking forward to finishing it very soon. This beast I will not be finishing very soon, but I am enjoying it. This is He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. I am buddy reading this with Miss L Adventures and really enjoying it. The first 100 pages were a bit of a slog, and I was very much like, oh no, is this going to be 900 pages of Anthony Trollope repeating himself again? But after the 100-page mark, we got introduced to some new characters, a lot of single ladies who are like my favorite characters, because I am one, and apparently I only like reading about myself. And they have really reinvigorated the story. There has been some really interesting viewpoints on gender, and always some really poignant and precise opinions on human nature and human behavior, which is just delightful to read. So I'm looking forward to continuing on with this. Probably won't finish it before October, but that's okay. Okay, I think I'm done talking now. Thank you for watching. Let me know what the highlights of your recent reading has been, and until next time, continue to be lovely.